Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Episode 198, Giovanni dalle Bande Nere Part 3, Pietro Aretino and shot down in a blaze of glory.
Lasci colli nelle valli, tra due salici piangenti, io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
Over the last two episodes, we have seen the rise of the formidable mercenary captain Giovanni dalle Bande Nere, son of a Medici born from a cadet branch of the family, Giovanni il Popolano, and our old friend, Caterina Sforza. Last time we saw that the Pope had sent him to Reggio Emilia to help the governor there, Florentine historian and politician Francesco Guicciardini. While in Reggio, Giovanni met a new frat boy buddy for his naughty escapades, Pietro Aretino. This guy was quite a character. He was from Arezzo, as his sort of surname states, Aretino meaning from Arezzo. He had refused to use his father's surname, having the man abandoned Pietro and his mother. The young man made his way to Perugia and then to Siena, starting to show his talents as a painter and especially writer. He finally ended up in Rome and became a popular member of the court of Leo X, distinguishing himself in particular for his venomous harsh verses against the pontiff's enemies, as well as his irony, cutting words, rather taboo topics, and his skill in putting on a good show. One of the main ways to communicate in this period was to use the talking statues. These weren't, of course, actual statues with the gift of speech, but monuments in public places, usually squares, where people could hang anonymous or, at times, signed poems or pamphlets. The poems in particular were usually polemic satirical writings aimed at political opponents, but they were also a way for certain more literate members of society to give voice to the malcontent of the public in general. The most famous of these statues was that of Pasquino, a statue from the 3rd century CE, which you can still see to this day, in his square of the same name, just around the corner from Piazza Navona on the other side of Palazzo Pamphili. The statue was so well known that the writings which were hung around his neck or on his feet assumed the names of pasquinades, almost a literary genre in itself. Pasquino gained particular notoriety around the time of a papal election, and it was upon the death of Leo X in 1521 that Pasquino was swarmed with notes, among which were the writings of Pietro Aretino. Were becoming more and more prominent. He threw his support behind Giulio de Medici, so when instead the more austere Hadrian VI was elected, who had been the victim of some of Pietro's most vicious writings, the poet thought it might be a good time for a change of scenery. That brings us back full circle to the meeting with Giovanni dalle Bande Nere in Reggio Emilia. However, before we get back to the great condottiero, let's just see Pietro along a bit further. He ended up heading back to Rome when his man Giulio de Medici became Pope Clement VII, but soon got in trouble, not with the Pope directly, but with a member of his staff, one Giovanni Maria Ghiberti, head of an ecclesiastical office that no longer exists, the Apostolic Dattaria. Ghiberti had never really liked Aretino and his dissolute life and scandalous writing, but the casus belli came in 1524 when the papal official had a friend of Pietro's, an engraver by the name of Marcantonio Raimondi, imprisoned. His crime had been to create a series of 16 engravings depicting erotic scenes originally created by artist Giulio Romano. Basically, they were into Renaissance porn. Pietro went over Ghiberti's head, intervening directly with the Pope, who had Raimondi freed. Aretino was not content with taking the win and letting the waters calm, but went on to rub salt in the wound by publishing 16 lustful sonnets to accompany the engravings. He was at this point wise enough to leave Rome for Arezzo and then join his friend Giovanni dalle Bande Nere in Fano on the Adriatic, and we'll see what he was doing there soon. When he felt it was safe, Pietro Aretino returned to Rome. It wasn't safe. He was attacked and stabbed, but managed to survive. There was no evidence that the papal datario Ghiberti was involved, but after the attack became public, those of his faction could be seen celebrating. Once again, without much help from Pope Clement, Aretino left Rome and went to join his friend Giovanni near Mantua, where would be at his side when the son of Caterina Sforza died. Pietro would continue to poke at his adversaries in Rome, but from afar, starting in Mantova, where he was hosted at the court of Marquis, soon-to-be Duke, Federico Gonzaga. Here, the long-term homosexual Aretino declared that he had fallen in love with a lady of the court, Isabella Sforza, complaining that she had converted him to women, but at the same time seeking the company of a young man identified as Figliuolo del Bianchino, the painter's young lad. Aretino's Roman enemies were not just sitting around, and they were putting pressure on Federico Gonzaga to do away with Pietro. Although he liked his court poet, Gonzaga was not willing to oppose Rome, so it may have been the Marquis himself who let Aretino know that it was time to go. He ended up in the place where his lifestyle would more easily be accepted, the Republic of Venice, where he would end his days at the age of 64, after having been married and having a daughter. Perhaps some of his more important and memorable works were La Cortigiana, which talks about the life of a Roman courtesan, and the Ragionamenti, the Reasonings. In the latter, there was a section called L'Educazione Sentimentale di Pippa, the sentimental education of Pippa, in which Pippa's mother is discussing which of the 3 possible destinies for a woman were more suitable for Pippa. The options were marriage, the convent, and prostitution. The conclusions were that prostitution was the best and safest option for the girl. But all of this rabbit hole started with the meeting between Pietro Aretino and Giovanni dalle Bande Nere in Reggio Emilia in 1521. The two became the best of buddies. After the election of Hadrian VI, the new pope sent Giovanni to Umbria to once again put down a rebellion by the Baglioni of Perugia. There was a standstill outside the town of Passignano. I would highly recommend a visit there, as it is on the lovely Lake Trasimeno. The standstill stemmed from the fact that the besieging papal army was made up of Italian and Swiss forces, and the Swiss were refusing to move if they didn't get paid. Giovanni rallied the Italian troops, betting on their pride. The town was taken the same day. The triumph was short-lived. Behind Giovanni's back, the Pope and Baglioni reached a deal, which meant that there was no money left over to pay the Black Band. By now, Giovanni had caught the attention of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was looking into bringing Giovanni on board. He instead went in the complete opposite direction, and in March of 1522, he entered into the service of King Francis I of France. We know that at the time Francis and Charles were fighting it out over control in Italy. The big engagement on the horizon in this context was the Battle of Bicocca in April 1522. Although not a major battle, in hindsight it was a turning point in warfare, with the ancient supremacy of the mounted knight accompanied by foot soldiers with pikes and halberds giving way to armies based around artillery and firearms. Giovanni once again distinguished himself, being the first and among the few to reach the enemy lines and getting shot in the arm and losing 3 horses for his troubles. The battle was a great victory for the opposing imperial forces, and afterwards Charles V and Francis I reached an agreement, but this time Giovanni managed to get paid. The Battle of the Bicocca had also shown that the age of mercenary companies was on its way out, and that gave Giovanni food for thought. What was he going to do when he grew up? One thing he could do was try to set out some sort of hereditary holding, carved out somewhere. After all, hadn't his great-grandfather gone from humble origins to becoming the Duke of Milan? Before that, hadn't Bartholomew Balls, Bartolomeo Colleoni, created a little patch for himself in Bergamo? A more recent example was that of his mother's arch-enemy, Cesare Borgia. To this end, he already had a foothold, the small town of Aulla in northern Tuscany, which he had occupied in his various operations and left a garrison there. Having said this, Giovanni did not have the strategy, the global vision, and the ambition of Borgia. What's more, Cesare had had the full political, moral, and financial support of his daddy, the Pope, while Giovanni's cousin, Pope Clement VII, saw him as more of a nuisance than anything else. Giovanni also used the break after the Battle of Bicocca to actually go and spend some time with his family. During this visit, he is reported to have found himself in the courtyard of his house, and having seen a nanny on the balcony above, holding little baby Cosimo de' Medici, the father asked the woman to throw the baby down to him. She at first refused, but faced with an angry order from him, she reluctantly threw the baby down for the father to catch him. I wonder if Mother Maria Salviati found out about it and what she had to say. Soon enough, Giovanni had an excuse to leave again, as complaints reached him from the Pope about the black bands causing havoc from Aulla in Tuscany all the way up through the Apennines to Reggio Emilia. This gave Giovanni the chance to meet up in Reggio with his new buddy Pietro Aretino for some more partying and womanizing. In particular, it seems that in this period he started up a relationship with a noblewoman by the name of Camilla Pallavicini. In 1523, the Italian wars were flaring up again, and this time Emperor Charles V managed to get Giovanni on board. But not much came out of this round, although he did manage to win a few minor skirmishes he was involved in. One interesting event from this period was when Giovanni took some prisoners and was then approached by someone who had a grudge against one of said prisoners and wanted to ransom him so that he could be assassinated. Giovanni was deeply offended by this dishonorable request and tied the person making the request to a tree in the freezing winter to die of exposure. It was only thanks to the intervention of one of the captains of the Black Bands that the man was set free. The year 1524 saw a temporary reprieve in Giovanni's financial troubles when his wife Maria decided to write to Pope Clement VII, who accepted to pay for all of the commander's debts, leaving him a clean slate to start accumulating more through gambling, banqueting, and womanizing. In the next round of fighting between France and the Imperials, Giovanni was tempted by French King Francis I with compensation beyond his wildest dreams, and the Pope was also leaning towards the French. It was in this period that we had the famous Battle of Pavia that we spoke about, in which the French suffered a disastrous defeat and the king himself was captured. Giovanni completely missed the battle. He had been out scouting and come across an enemy imperial foraging party which he had managed to defeat. Shortly after that, he was hit in the leg by a sniper bullet. The Pope sent his personal doctor, Berengario da Carpi, to assist him, and he was allowed to pass by the Imperials down to Piacenza, where he was passed into the care of another doctor, supplied by the Marquis of Mantua, Federico Gonzaga. This doctor was a Jewish man by the name of Abraham, which could allow us a very interesting digression into the Jewish presence in Italy, and in particular the illuminated Gonzaga and the slightly better situation the Jewish community had in Mantua. But we'll leave that for later. It's going to get its own space for discussion. Giovanni did not say a word, as he was operated on using only a little bit of alcohol to drink as an anesthetic. The shards of bone were then sent to the Pope as a present. At this point, he wrote a rare and affectionate letter to his wife, but then proceeded to inquire more after his dogs than his son. He went home for a bit to do some hunting and fishing, although he did so still with a limp from his wound. The family finances were running low again, and it is at this point that he completely closed off the possibility of setting up his own hereditary holdings when he sold Aulla. His black bands were also causing trouble. They had moved up into the Tuscan Garfagnana area, into the lands that were being now governed for the Pope by the poet Ludovico Ariosto, the claim to fame of our own little town of Reggio Emilia. Giovanni diverted the energies of the bands to a little project to try and set up a fleet to deal with the piracy situation in the Adriatic. They all went off to Fano, which is where he once again met with his buddy Pietro Aretino. The whole anti-piracy endeavour didn't lead to much. Then came the fateful year of the League of Cognac. This was the league set up by the Italian powers and France to counter the now dominance of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Giovanni was involved, but the supreme commander was the Duke of Urbino, Francesco della Rovere. Nevertheless, many contemporaries, including Niccolò Machiavelli, saw in Giovanni de' Medici the hopes of an Italian hero that could unite the country to expel the foreign aggressor. conveniently ignoring the fact that they were allied with another foreign aggressor in France. As the action started up, Giovanni was initially frustrated by the dithering and hesitance of Francesco della Rovere and by having his path blocked by the Este of Ferrara, as he was pursuing the imperial commander von Funsberg. The two armies finally met at the town of Governolo, near Mantova, where Giovanni managed to pull off yet another victory. It would be his last. As he was surveying the area after the battle, he was hit by a mortar shot by a man hiding in an old furnace. Unfortunately, he was hit in the back of the knee, where his armor did not cover the leg, smashing it to pieces. Ironically, no artillery had actually been fired during the battle. By the time he arrived on the operating table of Dr. Abraham, the gangrene had gone too far. His good friend and poet Pietro Aretino, perhaps exaggerating a bit, tells us that Giovanni refused the offer of 10 strong men to keep him still, saying that they would not have managed. He goes on to say that Giovanni himself calmly held a candle so that the doctor could see better as he amputated his leg and only cried out once when the saw was going through the bone. Despite the operation seeming to be a success, and Giovanni actually saying that he had started feeling better, on the 30th of November, 1526, at the age of 28, Giovanni de Medici died. His relative, Pope Clement, may have initially breathed a sigh of relief to have been rid of this inconvenient family member. But, as we know, the commander of the League of Cognac, Francesco della Rovere, abandoned the chase of the Imperials after the death of Giovanni, and they made their way down to Rome to brutally sack the city in 1527. The Black Bands passed under the command of Giovanni's nephew, son of Bianca Maria Riario, Pier Maria de' Rossi. The band sent a delegation to Giovanni's wife, Maria Salviati, asking for little Cosimo to be allowed to join them as their mascot. She very wisely refused. Although he was initially buried at the church of San Domenico in Mantua, Giovanni was then transferred to the family crypt at San Lorenzo in Florence. You can see the statue of Giovanni dalle Bande Nere if you go out from under the Uffizi Gallery in Florence and then turn and look back when you reach the river Arno. He stands defending the entrance back into the city and to Palazzo Vecchio, from where his son would reign over the newly created Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Thank you very much for listening. A History of Italy is a Satire Media podcast, created and hosted by me, Mike Corradi, and produced by my wonderful Patreon supporters, whom I would like to thank starting from the third of the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level, and they are Moppet King, MS, Nonna, Paradise, Patrizia K, Robin S, Rocco B, Rod L, Russell F, Sandra P, Sean M, Shelley, Shelby, Simon O, Stephen M, Tap Dance Down Under, and Thomas C. And of course, we cannot forget the tippy-top Maria Montessori and Dante Alighieri level, and they are Lisa K, Peter W, David L, David C, Sen, David A, Karen D, Bridget T, Dallas R, Joseph V, Stephen G, and Julian. If, like them, you'd like to have access to extra content, go to the website ahistoryofitaly.com to the support page, and you can click on the Patreon link to become a Patreon supporter, or just support us with a one-off donation on PayPal. Thank you very much if you do so. We are always very, very happy to just hear from you, and you can do that hello@ahistoryofitaly.com, or follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.